Okay. Yeah, I think this is a group of people who have an interest in public health and critical understandings of health and well-being. So partly I'm telling you what you already know, and that is that the pandemic, while it is morally neutral, the way it has impacted our societies has been deeply unequal, and that the nature of that inequality is largely about existing inequalities. So its chief operation and its encounter and engagement with people and culture and society has been to amplify pre-existing inequalities. It has created some new ones. I think that's fair to say, but mostly the inequalities we're facing existed before December 2019. Now, the pandemic impacts are not straightforward, as you all know, partly due to the complex epidemiology of the pandemic, but particularly to the nature of its encounter with cultures, people, and society. And I think the way it's phrased in the driest of places in the World Bank, they refer to the way in which the pandemic is hitting as, sorry, I'm just moving around here, as short-term impacts, but with long-term consequences. And I think that's true, that the impact of the pandemic was sharp at the very beginning, and was sharply unequal. But the bit that we can't afford to lose track of is the enduring and deep impacts of the pandemic. One of the things, and the World Bank is, again, a dry place to look at it, but their observations around the global nature of these impacts has been to point to its impact around worsening inequality. And so by both of the major indexes they use to measure inequality, we can see that it has gotten worse under the pandemic. And in this, they particularly likened it to the most recent sort of, which wasn't a natural event in the same way, but the global financial crisis, which they saw as actually improving global inequality, which is interesting in itself, especially that they still think that 10 years later, whereas the pandemic itself worsened inequality. And that this was particularly true not just across countries, as in that earlier slide, but within countries. And I'll be talking about our wealthy nation and our relationship with Pacific nations, but it's worth observing that across the world, we saw, even within developing and low-income countries, a worsening of inequality, not just between those countries and wealthy nations, for instance. And I guess where I'm going to kind of end up is to think about how that impacted education in particular, as well as I'll talk a little bit about health, but I'm well aware that I'm speaking to a health audience who are very well informed about this. So I think one of the things that we saw in New Zealand, and what I'll talk about, but was seen elsewhere in the world, which is we saw a huge decrease in the engagement with education across the pandemic. Quite a precipitous decline in participation in education. And of course, within that decline, there were other inequalities, particularly gender inequality and socioeconomic inequality, but also racial and other underserved groups experiencing these substantive declines. Now, why this kind of the structure of the pandemic interests me intellectually as well as ethically is because of the nature of amplification, that so many of these inequalities were not new to our knowledge and our experience. And so what the pandemic has done is actually accelerate inequalities that we should have already seen coming. In my book I published in 2019 around, which was called Island Time, sort of structured it around this Psalm 1 proverb, which is a way of reminding people that some things come from so far away. Manoa is the far eastern component of Samoa. If the rain comes from Manoa, it is something you should have seen coming. And while on the one hand, we can say that the epidemic caught us by surprise, and that's partly true. I mean, we knew one was coming. We didn't know it would take this form. We didn't know necessarily it would be a coronavirus. We did know that an epidemic would come because in the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen several global pandemics. And so with that kind of natural event meeting existing inequalities and amplifying them means that the knowledge we already had about inequality isn't erased, actually it becomes acutely more relevant. And that's the kind of structure I'd like to think about for the next 10 or so minutes. In New Zealand, how did we see this inequality be amplified? Well, the first bit was actually in the initial disease burden of COVID-19. And it now seems like we've been under this pandemic for a decade, not a little over 2 years. But if you remember back to August 2020 and particularly to July, Pacific people themselves actually experienced between 60 and 80% of the initial COVID infections. So actually the disease burden itself was powerfully unequal. And then just over a year ago, or just a year ago, nearly half of our COVID cases in Auckland, in New Zealand, were actually not just Pacific people, were actually specifically Samoan, and in particular in connection with the AOG church in Māngere. And that sort of points to the ways in which the social landscape interacted with the dynamics of the pandemic. It also was true that particularly the workers who were exposed to the border, and of course the chief human border in New Zealand is in Māngere, the gateway to the New Zealand nation, as it's often said. And so most of the workers who are truly frontline workers on New Zealand's borders were disproportionately Pacific and to some extent Māori workers. And so the actual work carried a level of risk in the early days of the pandemic that other workers didn't. And then, of course, this new concept we learned of in the pandemic, the idea of the essential worker. And the essential worker was kind of a bimodal construct where we had highly paid, highly skilled workers on one end, that is doctors and nurses, on one end of the essential worker spectrum, and at the other end, very poorly paid, far less well-educated people at the other, that is people in logistics and the service industries and the support industry, cleaners, and so on. And so while most of the essential workers carried a kind of disease risk with them, actually it was disproportionately carried by the lower paid, lower educated people in New Zealand. And I think, as we look forward, I think one of the critical pieces of work we need to do is not forget that category of essential worker, because we learnt it, and we learnt that it was meaningful. And of course, many of us learnt that we weren't essential in this way. And there was clearly a disconnect between the essential nature of this work and the level of compensation it receives, which I think should call many questions for us. Now, part of it was also the geographic distribution of the pandemic or its operation. So obviously, in the first 2 years of the pandemic, it was disproportionately concentrated in Auckland within New Zealand. But within Auckland, it was disproportionately concentrated close to the border, meaning South Auckland. And so it amplified inequalities that we all know are disproportionately present in South Auckland. So the inequalities are all ones we knew of, but we saw them operated in a different way within the context of the pandemic. I think it's worth just going over some of these in a more detailed sense. Obviously, when you go into lockdown and you are underhoused, homeless, transient, or living in an overcrowded home, the ability to lock down is actually quite limited. So that was an obvious inequality that was immediately a problem for New Zealand. And you will all know the statistics about who was in this category in New Zealand is disproportionately Māori and Pacific people, and to some extent migrants, poor people. Alongside that, within houses, we know that the people in that category are also strongly correlated with a group who are not connected digitally or are not connected to a social service, are transient across schools and social services, are less likely to have a close or even an official relationship with a primary healthcare practitioner and so on. And if you're in one of those homes that's not connected, that is overcrowded, it's also more likely to be damp or leaky. It's also more likely to be a less safe environment in a physical sense, and then of course it's not healthy. And if we aggregate those things, of course it means that you're less able to work or study remotely. That's obvious, and it was very true. Alongside that, and again, this is a health audience and knows all this, the health and wellbeing challenges, those existing inequalities were already clear. The mortality rates, the morbidity rates were already deeply unequal in New Zealand, particularly for Māori, Pacific and disabled people. What happened under COVID is we saw that both become even more consequential, but also we saw it increase. And unhealthy populations, as we're discovering right now, are more likely to have bad outcomes from infection, including death. So what we know about the health system was just made worse. The socioeconomic challenges were particularly visible in this as well, as at the same time we have at-risk people who were exposed through risk factors like challenges in their housing, but also driven by the need to work, were vulnerable in their workplaces. So many of them were the first to lose their jobs under the lockdown, particularly in industries, the service industries like hospitality, call centres and so forth, at the same time as they were the most likely to need to work. And they're the realities of the digital divide. And it's interesting that when I used to talk about the digital divide even 5 years ago, it was seen as passé, that the digital divide was not really a thing anymore in the age of the smartphone and the $35 Android device. But actually what we learned is that a $35 Android device without adequate connectivity, without the ability to actually run usable software to actually deliver work or study opportunities, didn't surmount a digital divide, as many of us have said, and that the connectivity into homes and the lack of appropriate devices and device usage was actually one of the key inequalities of this experience. And all that sort of wrapped up into what we already knew, that disadvantaged people in New Zealand, one characteristic of a disadvantage is that you have poor access to services across the spectrum. But also one outcome of disadvantage is that you have poor access to services across the spectrum. So that kind of vicious cycle was very true. Now, what was interesting to me was that under COVID, we also saw the opportunity to innovate and to change. And I think across the world, but particularly many of us will know what happened in New Zealand and the Pacific, there were social and political and governmental interventions that presented the opportunity for enduring beneficial outcomes. You know, one of them was that having been unable to house most of our people quite rapidly, the government was able to find often substandard and not totally fit for purpose accommodation, but accommodation for the majority of people that were homeless, not all, of course. And that's led to a different set of challenges in many parts of, particularly of Auckland. But it did show that it was possible under the right conditions. And I think it also showed that when we were driven by the outcomes, particularly around vaccination, that there were innovative approaches to healthcare. And you know, many of you will have participated in those. I mean, I did as well. So just not far from where I am on AUT South Campus, I was engaged in the a range of vaccination events at the Vodafone Centre, totally operated and led by Pacific health providers. And actually, those deliverers of vaccination took Pacific vaccination rates from the area of greatest concern and lifted them above the national level of vaccination rates. And I think the Pacific example is quite interesting because it seemed to produce better outcomes than the innovation we saw in Māori communities, partly because of the diversity and the distribution of Māori populations across cities and far more challenging rural environments. But it did point to the ability of health systems to change. And now, even though the pandemic is really peaking in New Zealand, or at least this wave is peaking, we're confronting the question about the durability of some of these innovations. One of them is, will we slowly exit people from being housed in social housing? Will we actually see this being basically labelled an emergency measure that now needs to be made business as usual, which would mean a change from some of the quite expensive housing provision we've gotten ourselves into over the COVID pandemic. Another one which I've been very interested in was, under the COVID response, the federal government put in place the first ever universal free school lunch program in the US, which in the eyes of most educators in the middle and lower ends of town has been an enormous success. And yet actually what we're seeing right now, not only is an exiting from that, but a refusal of any political leadership. So actually there won't be a bill presented to Congress to continue this. So I thought that's part of what's interesting about it, that no one is prepared to try and continue it. And yet the assessment is that it has been universally welcomed in education. I think in New Zealand, another example of that is we spun up a workforce, particularly a Māori, Pacific and migrant health workforce that were not clinically trained, but were supporting health outcomes. Now all those people are losing their work. So rather than become a permanent part of the health workforce, the people who were part of these vaccination centres are seeing their contracts end. And the knowledge and skill we captured over the pandemic is being lost and the knowledge and capacity is being lost, and the capability to some extent, because there's an enormous amount of cultural capability we see, particularly in Māori health provision and culturally centred health provision, that we'll lose. And then I guess the other one that was quite obvious was that New Zealand, having delayed committing to device provision in New Zealand schools, decided very rapidly that it would do it. I think no one would argue that it was done well, and it was limited by the number of devices that could be located in a time of supply chain stress. But actually, I had hoped that we crossed the bridge there to say that in order to be a successful student in New Zealand, you needed a device, and that would be a provision that was part of a public education. And I think we've seen that that isn't true. So devices are not going to be provided like they were. I think it was towards the middle of 2020 when that program began. What's interesting is that I think I'm committed, and I think probably other university leaders are, to this being true at universities. What we can't do is a universal device rollout, and I don't think we should do that. But what we have to be able to do is to ensure that all students have access to a device and recognise that that device can't just be limited to accessing it on campus in a computer lab. So although the school bit has clearly lost a social licence or is not being supported, I think universities now understand that for us to properly support our students, they will have to have devices. I think, and the last two things I really want to just sort of share some thinking around the educational equality that we've seen. And part of it is to really understand that most of the fixes we've seen in education have treated the educational challenge as a triage or a fleeting moment. And for me, the kind of typical one is a thing called the learning recognition credits. Many of you won't have heard of this. This was basically, and it looks like it will happen again this year. There was a recognition by NZQA that students were disadvantaged in the NCEA program, so that for every X number of credits, you would get Y LRCs on top of it. And that meant you could achieve UE having actually completed fewer UE, for instance, or level 1, level 2, level 3, having achieved fewer achievement standards. Now, of course, that's great, and I think that was fair. But what it doesn't acknowledge is that that's actual learning that didn't happen. The students who got learning recognition credits did not learn as much as students would have prior. And that's not me being an assessment purist. That's just simply the truth, that this was a disrupted and impacted year for our students, 2020, 21, and part of 2022. And so while schools come out of this having graduated students with the similar levels of achievement across NCEA and across UE, what universities then face is a group of students who haven't been as well prepared as they were in the past, and no mechanism like learning recognition credits to make up the difference. So if you imagine that, what I mean by that, if we take nursing, for instance, we know what we have to do to count a nurse as a nursing graduate, and we have to travel them along this journey. What the LRCs have said is, okay, basically this student we're going to say is at this point, even though we know they're at that point. And so universities actually carry this burden for the nation and in the education system. So that's one issue. But of course, and I won't get into my AUT position here, but not all universities carry this burden equally. And it's an honour to carry this burden, but it is a burden. If students in their thousands turn up and they don't have the same numeracy, literacy, scientific preparation that they did in past years, we have a problem. And we're not resourced. We have no extra resource within universities to deal with it. I've talked about the digital inequality, but I think sitting behind that is the deeper question, which we must put behind the device and connectivity piece, which is that within New Zealand there was a huge variation about the capability and preparedness of teachers, and I use the educators across the learning spectrum from preschool to PhD, to educate in digitally appropriate and digitally empowered ways. Now, if that was just a random pattern, it wouldn't have done anything to inequality, but we all know which schools were better prepared to deliver education digitally. So and those were the schools who were already doing it in some version, who had bring your own devices, who had teachers who were better trained and prepared in the pedagogy of teaching digitally, where there'd been investments in professional development and commitments and curriculum. Those were all in the wealthiest schools in New Zealand, and particularly in Auckland. So what that meant is the schools that faced disconnection the most, even when they were connected, were less well prepared to teach. And of course, it becomes more vicious than that, because actually in those homes of the schools which were less prepared to do it digitally, the parents are less likely to be educated themselves or to speak English, the language of most schools, fluently. So we saw this, I call it an aggregation of inequality, and it particularly sat in homes where, if you imagine that essential worker who themselves wasn't tertiary educated, who was having to go to work still, isn't at home to supervise learning, isn't digitally adept, and is working with a school that is trying to figure it out at the same time. And then we're saying that the New Zealand students are having an equal experience and are equally accessing opportunity. Of course, we know what that means. It's a falsehood that no one actually believes. And so, that's the kind of example that you could imagine. Many of these were the families that got COVID first. they're in churches and other community groups that expose them, and this aggregated disadvantage was very real to them. Now, the reason I think education along with health is so important in this is that at the moment, our setting is to see this as a 2 to 3 year challenge we need to surmount. And that if we can get through the next 2 to 3 years, we will have fixed the COVID deficit of learning. And actually what I really need everyone to understand that the biggest deficit would have been experienced, not even in the most unequal ways at years 11 to 13, but actually in years 1 to 3, where, or maybe even through to 1 to 7, where actually it is very hard to deliver curriculum digitally, even for the well-off schools. So there were some, there were a couple of New Zealand edutech companies that delivered in this space. There's one called Classroom Dojo, for instance, that was designed for 5 to 8 year olds and to be delivered on phones. But actually, it is very hard to teach 5 to 8 year olds who are not functionally literate in the way that they can be self-efficacious learners, as the lingo goes. So that kind of learning deficit, which has happened, that opportunity lost for students from 5 to 8, which has been very 5 years to 8 years old, which has been very unequal as well, is particularly challenging. And I think what that means is that we will be dealing with this for a generation. And I think that's really important to realise, because universities like the one I'm at, who are up for this and designed to serve these students and deliver opportunity, will not see a break from this for some time.
Apologies, Damon. You have 4
Sure.
minutes. Thank you.
No worries. This is my last slide, I think. And I guess the other challenge that we face is that exactly this group that I've described, sort of the intersectional group where many of these factors are at play in their lives or their homes, many of them simply left school and will not return. And so we saw incredibly high rates. Many of you have seen that only 40% of Auckland students regularly attended school last term, right? And if we dig down to there, it's as high as 80% in some age groups in some schools. And so many have left, either formally or partly, and that's because we have high inflation, they need the money, and they can get a job. And this continuing absence or challenge with attendance, which is true in universities as well as schools, is part of the problem. Now, I think, and this is my final slide, is really to think through some of what we can do with this. I mean, one of the opportunities is that at this moment, and I don't often quote Milton Friedman, but I got a little bit concerned ethically with people saying, why waste a crisis? I understand the don't let a crisis go to waste, but it is actually a crisis, and that means people are experiencing it as a crisis. And so we do have to actually deal with the crisis, as well as push our transformative programs. So we do need to do it, but we also need to understand the people that are in harm's way here and support them in this change. We also need to make sure that the positive steps we make we don't retreat from as we enter a post-pandemic phase. And I actually think there's a huge risk for this. We also need to, some of the things we stopped because of COVID, there is a real opportunity when they're harmful to make sure we don't start them again. Many of the things people have said we always had to do, we proved we didn't have to do. And then I think the final thought, and I'm not saying I know completely what the kaupapa is here, although I think Dr. Juliet and Dr. Sari have kind of outlined part of it, is that we need to make sure that we've learned from this and we can focus on the kaupapa of improvement that comes after this. I was going to mention briefly around how this intersects with our Pacific neighbourhood. I guess the one bit I wanted to raise, and I guess if I was to use a number, and I'll close on this, is to point to the integration of of New Zealand's Pacific neighbours with our economy. And so, for instance, in Samoa and Tonga, the two major GDP activities in Samoa and Tonga are remittances, chiefly from New Zealand, Australia, and the US, which in both Samoa and Tonga constitute more than a fifth of GDP, and tourism, which in Samoa constitutes a quarter of GDP, and in Tonga, it's significantly less, but still a large amount. So overnight, they lost an extraordinary amount of their GDP. And so as we think about uplifting New Zealand, and we need to think about the people who actually are dependent on New Zealand's well-being and its relationships. And I'll leave it there, and thank you for your time and attention. Kia ora koutou.